Welcome to the Intrusions Indepth podcast. This is Josh Stepp. Imagine a battlefield where the cracked earth is churned by tank treads and the sound of distant gunfire echoes through the air. Smoke and dust clouds the sky, while soldiers crouch low in a trench, huddled together to trap what little heat and warmth there is. Now picture one soldier holding an Android phone with an app open on its screen. Their face is illuminated by its glow. They aren't playing a game or looking for the next TikTok craze. No, they're zeroing in on the enemy with pinpoint accuracy. This is Ukraine, 2014. Amidst the chaos of war, technology had become both a lifeline and a weapon. The app they were using was called Correction D30, as a Ukrainian name, but I translated it to English, and I'm going to use that name, of course, because my Ukrainian's terrible. But this app, developed by a Ukrainian artillery officer, Yaroslav Sherostuk, is used to make targeting with the Soviet-era D-30 howitzers faster and more precise. What once took minutes on the battlefield now takes seconds to calculate. But in the shadows, another group watched closely. Not on the battlefield, but on the internet. Fancy Bear, a cyber espionage group linked to the Russian military intelligence apparatus, the GRU. Fancy Bear inserted a variant of their X-Agent malware into this very app and distributed the infected versions to Ukrainian soldiers. The malware was subtle, hidden within the app's legitimate functions. This made it almost undetectable, all the while collecting location data, communications, contact detail, all from the infected device, transmitting this treasure trove of information back to Russian forces. For Ukraine's military, the consequences were devastating. Reports suggest that between 15 to 20% of their D-30 howitzers were lost in combat. Russian forces allegedly used the collected data to track and anticipate Ukrainian artillery movements, executing strikes with chilling precision. This wasn't just cyber espionage. This was total war. Cyber warfare integrated with kinetic military tactics. Fancy Bear's actions marked the first time X-Agent had been observed on Android devices. In this episode, I dive into how the app was compromised, the technical analysis of the malware, Fancy Bear, and their connection to the incident. But first, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
Now, before we get started, I think it's best to spend a little bit of time explaining the D-30 howitzer weapon system. The howitzer D-30 is a Soviet-designed 122mm artillery piece that's been in countless conflicts since it was first introduced in the 1960s. It's a towed gun, meaning it can be hitched to a vehicle and transported to various locations on the battlefield. This mobility is one of its key advantages, allowing it to quickly set up, fire, and then move to a new position to avoid the counter battery. But what makes the D-30 impressive is its accuracy. This is achieved through a complex set of calculations that take into effect a variety of factors, multiple variables. When a target is identified, the crew must determine its distance using a rangefinder or by relying on forward observers. Then they consult the firing tables that provides information on the appropriate charge and elevation needed to hit the target. These calculations are based on ballistics, the science of how projectiles travel through the air. The crew must account for the shell's weight, the propellant charge, air resistance, wind speed, and direction, and even the Earth's rotation at some times. All these factors can affect how the shell's trajectory goes. So maybe having an app for this could be beneficial. Traditionally, to make these complex calculations quick in the heat of battle, the D-30 is equipped with a mechanical firing control system. This includes a panoramic sight for aiming and a gunner's quadrant for measuring elevation. The crew inputs the necessary data, and the system helps make the adjustments for the gun's position. But all of this takes minutes. next to the gun, and it isn't fast or precise as something like an app. But once these calculations are complete, the shell is loaded and the howitzer is ready to fire. The D30 can launch a variety of munitions, including high explosive rounds, armor-piercing rounds, and even tactical nuclear shells. Its maximum firing range is around 15 kilometers or 9 miles, though this can be extended with the use of rocket-assisted projectiles. And this is where modern technology comes into play. Ukrainian forces started using this custom-built app designed specifically for the D30 howitzer. This app streamlined the entire targeting process, turning what used to take several minutes for a task into what can be completed in just a few seconds. By inputting the variables like target coordinates, weather conditions, and ammunition type, the app would instantly provide the precise calculations needed to aim and fire the artillery round. Not only did this app speed up the operations, but it also reduced the likelihood of human error. There's no more squinting at charts or risking that misplaced decimal under the stress of incoming fire. The app had become an indispensable tool in the battlefield, enhancing both their efficiency and their accuracy. However, integrating smartphones into military operations opened up a new vulnerability. While this app was a tactical advantage, it also became a potential gateway for cyber threats. The convenience of digital technology came with the risk of digital espionage and sabotage. And that's exactly what happened. It all started with Yaroslav Sherstuk, a Ukrainian artillery officer who wanted to make targeting easier for his fellow soldiers operating the Soviet-era D30. He developed an Android app called Correction D30, and that reduced targeting times. The app quickly gained popularity among Ukrainian artillery forces, with over 9,000 personnel reportedly using it. It was a game changer, allowing them to be more efficient and effective in their operations. But here's where things took a dark turn. Fancy Bear, a Russian cyber espionage group linked to the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency, saw an opportunity. We'll talk more about them in a minute. But they took the app and injected it with a variant of their very own X-Agent malware. This infected version of the app was then distributed on Ukrainian military forums starting in late 2014. Unsuspecting Ukrainian soldiers downloaded what they thought was a legitimate tool, only to find out that it was a Trojan horse. The malware within the app quietly collected sensitive information from the infected devices, location data, communications, contact details, and then transmitted it all back to the attackers. This gave Russian forces unprecedented insight into the Ukrainian artillery movements and positions. And in a conflict, it's incredibly nice to be able to track your adversary. However, if your adversary is also an artillery troop, there's a good chance you can track the artillery as well. Now, shooting D30s at each other, or D30 types of weapons at one another, is like a complicated game of Angry Birds. Nowadays, they're using 155mm M777 howitzers, as they have more options for firepower and stronger firepower, and more importantly, better guidance systems, and the ability to shoot GPS-guided rounds. But this was 2014 through 2016, prior to the large-scale invasion that happened 31 months ago at the time of this recording. As mentioned above, this app wasn't distributed on the App Store like Google Play. It was in forums, shared by the military, it appears. But there was also quite a few safeguards put in place to attempt to limit the spread of potential compromise. The developer required the use of an activation code and to contact them via SMS, text messages, or Skype. All this had to be done prior to the application giving you access to the calculator for the artillery. Now, on the surface, this seems like robust safeguards. And one big takeaway we can all gather from this current conflict is the creativity of the Ukrainians to fight back with low-cost but highly effective methods. Between the 3D printed drones, makeshift munitions, the jet ski kamikaze drone things, and even in this instance, the use of an app to augment a 50-year-old piece of artillery is pretty genius. But looking at this report and, well, the outcome, a Trojan app, it appears, got caught up in the age-old mistake of trying to roll your own crypto. Plus, being written in Java Getting it back to a readable form once you have the APK isn't hard in most cases. But back to the report. According to CrowdStrike, they were only able to link the app being used in a possible training role and with at least one unit in an operational role. Now, what's unclear to me is if this was one unit of 50 howitzers or one of the units of 50 howitzers, like a unit within a squadron or something. And CrowdStrike assessed that the development of this app was between late April 2013 and early December 2014. So over a 1.5 year window. The first places it showed up was Russian language Ukrainian military forums. And I think I need to explain that real quick. While Russian is widely spoken in Ukraine, especially in eastern regions, recent laws have promoted the use of Ukrainian as the official state language in public spheres like education, media, and government services. This is also usually in services businesses as well, like dining, restaurants, etc. However, speaking Russian is not banned in Ukraine. Individuals are free to use it in private communications and conversations with one another. But the laws aim to strengthen the use of Ukrainian without criminalizing the use of Russian. So it wouldn't be odd to have Ukrainian soldiers or military members know and use Russian, especially on a form. And on a geopolitics scale, of course, this is when Crimea had recently been annexed and the Maidan Revolution had occurred, which made hostilities in eastern Ukraine much more tense. Not as tense as they are now, but more tense than they were previously. So CrowdStrike assessed that this would be the driving factor behind Trojaning this app, which I would agree. And the fact that if you were the Russians, or the Russian-aligned separatists in the region, you might want to know where the howitzers are. They are going to be shelling you into next week, so it's a good thing to know where they're at. Now back to this incident. The consequences were devastating. Reports indicate that the Ukrainian military lost between 15 to 20% of their D-30 howitzer units, partially due to the enhanced targeting capabilities of the compromised app provided to the Russian forces. Although to be fair, we don't have numbers for like a control or how effective they were at destroying the weapon system pre-compromised app. I don't really think Russia's going to release like the before and after metrics for that anytime soon. Are you struggling for topics on date night? Share this podcast to spark engaging conversations. And give us a thumbs up while you're at it. Maybe jot down a quick review on iTunes. Together, we'll make sure you never run out of things to talk about. I'm here for you. Help me help you. Now back to our show. Now I think it's a good time to bring up Fancy Bear. Fancy Bear goes by numerous names. Some of the more common ones you may have heard of is APT28 from Mandiant, Sedent from ESET, Sophacy from Kaspersky, Strotanium from Microsoft, and Threat Group 4127 from SecureWorks. And I'm sure I'm missing some. Also, APT28, Fancy Bear, has been active for a while. I could do an entire episode or series of them, to be honest, on all of their exploits. I'm seriously scratching the surface here. And since this question would come up all the time, let's answer it right here, right now for everyone. Why does the same threat actor have so many names? I sympathize and I agree that it would be easier if they all stuck to the same naming standards. But whose? Also, these threat intelligence groups, both public and private sector, are working off of models and indicators, artifacts, etc. at the same time, and they're not sharing information with each other for multiple reasons. So this is why one group may call it a threat actor APT28, while others will call them Fancy Bear. And speaking of Fancy Bear, how did they get this name? How did this name stick? Well, we can thank CrowdStrike for that, and partially Dmitry Alperovich, the co-founder of CrowdStrike. Now he runs a DC think tank and policy accelerator organization. He's also a member of the Cyber Safety Review Board, CSRB, and a frequent guest on the Risky Business podcast. He also did an episode of Change Agents recently with Andy Stump. I'll link it in the show notes. You should check it out. Needless to say, he gets around and he's been in the game for a while. Anyway, Dmitry Alperovich developed a system in which an animal represents the threat actor group's origin country. Russia is a bear, China the panda, Iran the kitten, and North Korea the kalima, a winged horse creature. Then, by tradition, the researcher or employee of CrowdStrike that discovers the new threat group gets to name it. The word sophisy appeared in the malware sample, and this researcher thought it sounded a lot like the chorus from Iggy Azalea's smash hit Fancy. You know the words. I'm so fancy, you already know. And you know the song. It's a masterpiece after all. Now, I want to quote Scott Shapiro from his book Fancy Bear Goes Fishing to explain the GRU. Quote, the GRU has a long reputation of being the most gonzo of the Russian intelligence services. Gennady Gudlov, a Russian opposition politician who served in the KGB, said GRU officers referred to themselves as the bad guys who act. Need us to whack someone? We'll whack them. Need us to grab Crimea? We'll grab Crimea. End quote. Now, taking a step back, the GRU, or Main Intelligence Directorate, serves as Russia's primary military intelligence agency, operating under the Russian Ministry of Defense. Unlike the more well-known FSB or SVR, the GRU specializes in gathering and analyzing military intelligence, overseeing covert operations, and in recent years, playing a key role in cyber warfare. The GRU was established in 1918, shortly after the Russian Revolution, and has a long history of conducting cyber espionage and military reconnaissance for the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation. During the Cold War, the GRU became synonymous with deep cover intelligence agents, military operations abroad, and maintaining extensive spy networks across the globe. A very secretive organization. There are accounts, and I don't know how true they are, but of GRU officers entering the agency to find out that their father or their uncle was also a member of the agency, and they never knew. And it was instrumental in gathering information on Western military activities, advancing Soviet interests during some of the most tense geopolitical standoffs around the Cold War. Today, the GRU is still involved in traditional military intelligence work, but has expanded its capabilities significantly. This includes supporting Russian military operations abroad, particularly in conflict zones like Syria and Ukraine. The GRU is also deeply embedded in Russia's strategic planning and defense operations, providing critical intelligence on NATO movements, foreign military developments, and other global threats to Russian interests. They also like to put Novichok nerve agent on doorknobs and in trash cans in Salisbury, England. But hey, no one's saying these are the good guys. However, over the last decade and a little longer, the GRU has evolved into a major player in cyber operations. It's known for high-profile cyber attacks that target foreign governments, critical infrastructure, and even international organizations. Whether it's through the use of the notorious Unit 7445, also known as APT-44, or Sandworm, or APT-28, better known as Fancy Bear, the GRU has made headlines for disrupting elections, waging cyber warfare, and conducting espionage on a global scale. Now, looking at the malware, Focal Point did an analysis of the Android X agent sample, the malware used in this attack. They received a sample of the Trojan app in question. Right off the bat, Focal Point makes an assertion that I think should have been asked earlier. Why does the use of X agent automatically make the threat actor Fancy Bear? According to this report, and what research I can find, version 1 of X agent was released in November 2012, targeting Windows operating systems, mostly desktops. And version 2 was released in 2014 with Linux support. Version 3 added an exploit kit to the mix, and version 4 implemented some obfuscation. In 2015, X agent made the jump to mobile. First, it targeted iOS Apple devices through the use of the jailbroken process. Then it moved on to Android in the form of this Ukrainian military app. It's also key to note that this is the only observed sample of X agent in Android. And digging into the guts of the analysis sort of requires an understanding of Java and object-oriented programming principles. I'm going to do my best to keep this applicable to all audiences. So first, when the application starts, the network receiver class is instantiated. This happens when the malware detects that there's network connectivity. Now, once network connectivity is confirmed, the network receiver class starts a new instance of another class called alarm receiver. Alarm receiver is responsible for triggering the rest of the operation. Now, periodically, the alarm receiver starts the main service class, which is the core service that drives the malware's actions. Main service is the primary implant class. It contains the logic for the recon functionality and the command and control communications back to the implant server or the command and control server. And after its execution, main service pauses its operation and the cycle kind of resumes with the alarm receiver triggering the next operation of main service. And we'll go into what main service does in a moment. Now, to avoid the kind of telltale signs of being a beacon, the network receiver class executes asynchronous. In other words, there's no set amount of time in between callouts to check network state. If no network state is detected, the main service is stopped. Then it comes back online once a network connection is established. And I think that's a good pivot into persistence. And in an effort to accommodate some of the feedback I've gotten on previous episodes, I'll explain this concept a little bit. Now, for persistence, malware needs a way to stick around. Otherwise, it just vanishes the second you restart the device. So persistence is all about how the malware stays active and continues its operation over time, surviving a reboot. And this isn't exclusive to malware. Normally, programs have a way to persist as well, but you know about them, so they don't really have to be doing it in covert ways. Malware obviously is trying to remain hidden, so it has to use more covert tactics. So on mobile operating systems like Android, persistence works a bit differently compared to like a desktop operating system. For instance, on a desktop, malware might just launch itself and boot using registry keys, like the run keys or something in Windows. And then it stays running in the background. But on Android, we have a few challenges. The big one being that the malware running in the background will kill your battery, and kill your battery in no time. So instead of running continuously, mobile malware is designed to pop up at regular intervals to use certain tricks to launch itself when necessary. Now, specifically on Android, the malware waits for signals sent out by the operating system itself. Think of it like a secret handshake. Android sends out certain messages when it boots up, and malware is ready to listen for these. In technical terms, these signals are called intents. What happens is that when the malware registers with the system to listen for specific intents, and when it hears them, it springs to action. So when we're talking about persistence on Android, we're not just talking about the malware starting on boot, it's also about how it cleverly listens for these triggers to reactivate itself and start executing the malicious code. Let's pull this thread a little deeper and dig into intents, receivers, and services. Like I said earlier, intents are tiny messages sent between different parts of the Android operating system. They can signal when an event happens, like when an app starts or when the screen turns off, and malware listens for these intents to know when it should be operating. Now, receivers are components in the Android operating system that allow applications, including malware, to subscribe to these intents. Those receivers listen for these intents from across the Android system. Now, when an intent matches certain criteria as broadcasted, malware jumps back into action. Or the app does. Malware, in this case, just being a bad app. Then we have services. Services are a class in Android designed to handle the background operations. Malware can use services to perform its task, even when you're not actively using your phone. For instance, it can launch a service to perform malicious actions whenever an intent is triggered on it, like when the screen turns off. And since services don't require the app that starts it to remain open, this is a popular method for remaining hidden. So back to the sample. These threat actors, Fancy Bear according to CrowdStrike, needed a way to send data from the phone to the C2 command and control infrastructure, and from phones using this app, which presents some challenges. First, these are battlefield apps, and network connectivity through Wi-Fi or 4G, 5G, GSM, etc. isn't always a given. Now, to be fair, in today's war, everyone uses Starlink, so I guess it's not always the case in 2024 AD, but we get the point. Second, the Trojan app still needs to function when those conditions aren't met, as the original functionality didn't require network connectivity. It's just a calculator app, after all. If no network is available, the malware remains dormant. If it can't send data back from the phone, there's no need in it being active to drain the battery. If the network is available, the malware kicks off by creating a new instance of the alarm receiver class. And this is where things get sneaky. The alarm receiver sets an alarm using the method setAlarm. Nothing crazy there. And the alarm behaves like a scheduler to ensure the malware can periodically do its actions without constantly running. Remember, we're not trying to drain the battery. Plus, this makes it harder to detect. Not to mention, there's limited visibility of this type of action on phones or mobile devices in general. But here's the kicker. The malware writes the preference entry, called true, to its XML preferences file. Now, an XML preferences file is a type of file used to store simple application preferences or settings in a structured format. Now, these files are typically used to save data that applications need to retain between sessions, such as user preferences, configuration settings, or other small bits of information. The entry this malware uses is in the XML file, signals that network connectivity exists. Now, if the network is no longer available, the preference is set to false and any previous services are stopped. Now, this method is incredibly efficient for malware because it doesn't require malicious code to be running constantly. Instead, it only activates during certain conditions, like when a network change occurs. And if there's a network connectivity, you can send data, so that makes it highly efficient. And you typically can't read these XML files from the phone, although game hackers have figured out a way to modify them for game cheats, but that's another time and place in another episode to discuss all that. And moving away from persistence and into the capabilities of the malware, we need to remember that this app's focus, the Trojan app's focus, was based on reconnaissance, or more specifically, ISR capabilities. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The coordinated collection, processing, and dissemination of information about enemy forces, terrain, and other critical factors to support decision-making and operations on the battlefield. Now, the core of these capabilities lies within the main service class, like we said earlier, which handles the bulk of the reconnaissance functionality. But what does it actually do? Well, it queries various components of the devices, including communication records and sensors, like the GPS and the camera, and other crucial data sources such as the installed applications, internet connectivity, and system information about the phone. To gain access to all the sensitive data, the malware relies on Android's permission system. When the malware is installed, it needs to request permissions to access certain hardware or data sources. Once these permissions are granted, the malware has everything it needs to run its spy operation. And through the use of social conditioning and a need to use the app, I would imagine most users just simply click through all of the warnings. And like I said earlier, unlike desktop malware, where processes can run continuously, Android apps, including malware, are paused or stopped when they're not actually being used to conserve battery life. But Android allows background processes, and this is where the malware gets sneaky. It performs its reconnaissance in the background by querying various sensors and databases and files on the device. This way, it can grab the valuable information even without the device appearing to be operational or when it's idle, or when it's not in use for artillery targeting, for instance. Now, getting into the weeds a little bit, the main service class constructs HTML formatted strings containing the gathered data. It uses Android's built-in classes to structure the data into readable logs that can be sent back to the attacker's infrastructure. This focal point report also had a few examples of the intel that the app was gathering. Wi-Fi, in this case, captured everything from the link speed of the network ID, the MAC address, the IP address, and even the signal string. Then the malware constructs these strings in real time and then sends them back to the attacker for further analysis. Coupling this information with GPS information allows you to map networks used by the enemy, just as an easy to understand use case. I could probably spend another hour discussing all the capabilities listed and how they could be used on the battlefield by an adversary, but I think the key takeaway here is that the malicious app was using Android's built-in APIs to query this data and report it back when it connected onto a network. Some of these APIs, the big one being all about phone command, which I would assume you figured by the name, was gathering all the information related to the phone's identity and connectivity. And then using classes like the account manager, telephony manager, and GSM cell location, it pulled information about the Google accounts linked to the device IDs, the GSM, the CDMA, the cell locations, and the SIM state. There's also functionality to get all the call details from the device, metadata like call duration, dates, and times. It also got a list of all the files on the device, the applications installed, and the contact list. Additionally, the SMS and browser history was gathered as well. So you can imagine that you could build a pretty impressive pattern of life or blueprint of all the connected devices and how they were used and the communications between them. Adding to that equation is that this is a Trojan military app, and it makes the signal-to-noise ratio very favorable if you're a Russian. Very few, if any, civilians would install an app for howitzers, after all. so you could make a reasonable assumption that anyone using this app is a lawful military target, or at the very least, someone you want to track. But in order to do all this, the malware needs to talk. Specifically, it needs to talk to its command and control servers. The gist of this communication process is that the implant uses GET requests to receive commands from the C2 server and POST requests to send back any responses or data it has gathered. Now, this is nothing fancy, as this is traditionally how X-Agent has communicated in other variants. But what makes this tricky, well, besides it being mobile and getting communication visibility is obscured to begin with, is how it builds URLs. And admittedly, this is very difficult to explain in a podcast. And if you don't look at network traffic very often, probably feel free to ignore this for the next 2 minutes. But the basic template for the URLs is HTTP, the protocol, IP address /path /param equals value and param equals value, etc., all the way to the token. Now, the malware communicate with the known IP address, in this case 69.90.132.215. The path in the URL is randomly selected from the reg URI string from the main service. This means the specific endpoint is not always fixed, adding another layer of variability to the communications. Parameters and values follow a standard format, where key pieces of data, like tokens or parameters, are included to authenticate or track the request. Then the payload has the actual stolen information in it. So what's really happening here is the X-Agent malware is operating with a flexible communications protocol by randomizing parts of the URL and encoding data in different formats. And this makes it much harder for security tools to detect and block its communications, especially ones based on header pattern matching. Now this, combined with the use of standard network methods like GET and PUT, ensure that the malware can kind of stay under the radar while quietly sending and receiving instructions from its command and control server. And you need a way to observe this traffic. If it's going through Wi-Fi, like a Wi-Fi hotspot or something, then the network is instrumented. Sure, this may be easy to catch. But on the battlefield using cell networks, probably not so much. Now, the focal point report I used for this went into the weeds about RC4 encryption, messaging formats, and how the information was passed, and it's great for a white paper. But for audio-only mediums, it's not the best fit. And I would normally tell you to go to Focal Point and download it or read it, but it's not there anymore for some reason. I had to download it from Scribed, but I put a link to that in the show notes if you want to check it out. This warning, some of the ads are pretty brutal if you don't have an account. Now, the last part of this report is where I want to jump to. Their analysis of the attribution to Fancy Bear. For this analysis, the researchers did not rely on active threat intelligence, but instead used publicly available data and constructed a deep dive into the APK file of the Trojan app. They focused on identifying similarities between Corrections D30 and other known X-Agent malware strains, particularly those reported on in earlier research by companies like ESET and Trend Micro. One key comparison made was to the X-Agent implants, particularly looking at the functionality present in both the Android and iOS versions of the malware. The iOS variant of X-Agent showed similar behavior, including it collected SMS history, call logs, contact lists, and location data. And it also used a similar method to construct the command and control protocol request. It formatted its output to HTML to display the results on the C2 server. Interestingly, while Corrections D30 and the iOS X-Agent implant shared many features, there were some differences in how they handled certain types of information. For example, the exact functionality around location data remains uncertain in this Android sample. Focal Point then went on to utilize the Diamond model to compare this attack to other known Fancy Bear attributed attacks, mainly the attack on the DNC. Focal Point wasn't convinced, but let's talk about it. Attribution in cybersecurity is a rigorous scientific process, usually, at least for the big players in the field and the government involved. With the caveat that I said usually. Even with the wealth of data, it's incredibly rare to be 100% certain about who conducted an attack. Threat intelligence groups usually settle on conclusions like, we assess with low, medium, and high confidence. and then they acknowledge that absolute certainty is nearly impossible to attain. And in this case, the focal point researchers are careful not to jump to conclusions. They note that while the C2 command and control protocol and other characteristics match X-agent samples, they don't have enough behavioral or specific actor-based evidence to definitively say this implant is linked to APT28 or the DNC hacks. And this is a common challenge in malware analysis. The typical methods used to analyze APT intrusions on traditional networks, like tracking IP addresses, examining how adversaries move across networks, or studying command structures, don't always apply to mobile malware investigations like this one. Mobile threats behave differently and have less of a network-based footprint seen in traditional attacks, making attribution a little more difficult. Plus, the longer the TTPs and toolsets are out, and more likely they are to be mimicked, copied, reused, repurposed, etc. You see, as far as I can tell from this report, the initial CrowdStrike one on the D30 app being compromised, the two core pieces of evidence pointed to this malware being the work of the group known as Fancy Bear included the use of X-agent or X-agent similar malware, and the Ukrainian military forces were fighting pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine at the time. Now remember, this is post-Maidan color revolution and pre-Russian launch of special military mission current invasion of Ukraine. I think Focal Point summed it up best in the conclusion of their report, with quote, "However, Focal Point has raised questions about the attribution of the Fancy Bear threat actor. X-agent has been, quote, in the wild since 2012, is relatively easy to obtain, and has been well documented, including in our report below. Further, ESET was able to obtain the source code for the report in 2016. While the implant's known availability, any number of threat actors in this addition to Fancy Bear could have been in possession of the implant during the Russian-Ukraine conflict from 2014 to 2016. Focal Point's report concludes that while it's likely that the malware can be attributed to Russian-affiliated actors, there's simply not enough public evidence to link the malware to Fancy Bear in particular. And because the malware's tenuous collection of imprecise referential positioning data, it is likely that the malware was only used for traditional espionage and information gathering, not precise military strikes. Lastly, since it's not known how many devices were infected and which ones were infected, there is no way to substantiate any claim that this ties X-agent to Russian strikes on Ukrainian artillery." End quote. Additionally, even the Ukrainian military disputed this report's finding that howitzers were destroyed as a result of this campaign. In a release on their website, they stated, quote, "The information of the command of missile troops and artillery of the Ukrainian ground forces is that losses in artillery weapons during the anti-terrorism operations were way below those reported by the media, which claimed 80% of the howitzers were lost, and have nothing to do with those stated causes. Currently, missile and artillery units of the Ukrainian ground forces are entirely combat ready, equipped, and capable of performing assignments," the ministry said on its website. End quote. And I'm not trying to call anyone a liar or anything like that, but when people are engaged in combat or war or conflict, they usually aren't too forthcoming with facts. The Ukrainian general isn't going to publicly state, "Hey, your campaign against our howitzers, the main weapon we've been using to shell the separatists, is working great. You broke 80% of them. Congrats." Obviously, this would be foolish, and I'm just stating that you need to recognize who has skin in the game and what their stakes are, and ultimately how much you trust what they're saying. There's also like a kayfabe element in there. Everyone has a character to play, like professional wrestling. I mean, for that matter, you could also assess, why did CrowdStrike name this to Fancy Bear? And I guess this is a good time for my newest segment.
Believe it or not, it's conspiracy time. Tinfoil hats stuck on our heads, following trails that intertwine. Where do they lead? Believe it or not, we'll see.
Now, I'm just spitballing here off the top of my head, and this is fresh off the 2016 DNC hack. So Fancy Bear and Russian hackers in general were attributed to interfering with the United States election, and the DNC attack was investigated by CrowdStrike. Maybe there's an element of staying with the hot hand and keeping Russian APTs in the news cycle for publicity or marketing or something. But critics could also say that it's for election purposes as well. And that's not my take, full disclosure, but the argument is completely absurd. CrowdStrike did the investigation of that incident, and unsurprisingly, when things get political, there's some controversy around it. Now, CrowdStrike has published a post, and I'll link it, on their website explaining their position. But I want to approach this from a more general, broad stance. Starting with the FBI. The FBI did not physically access the compromised DNC servers. Instead, they relied on forensic data and analysis provided by CrowdStrike, the cybersecurity firm hired by the DNC. Now, critics argue that the FBI should have conducted its own independent examination to ensure a comprehensive and unbiased investigation. The high-profile nature of the DNC hack led to increased scrutiny, and rightfully so, as this was another nation-state conducting information operations in political parties' computers ahead of an election for president. Plus, if the FBI is going to say the Russians hacked the DNC, they should at least do their own investigation to get there. Sure, maybe they don't run IR or remediate, but I'm sure they have the capabilities of investigating forensics logs. They're able to produce evidence for other cases. Surely they can produce something with hard details. Show some receipts here. Now, critics also worried that the indirect handling of evidence might affect the legal chain of custody. And I would assume that CrowdStrike wasn't operating within like Title 18 or Title 3 or any real authority for that matter. Now, this episode isn't focused on the DNC hack or the leaks of emails from 2016 or the Russian influence operations at the time. The point I'm trying to make is that CrowdStrike was kind of in the news around this time for being a cybersecurity firm that found the Russians in the DNC. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility to keep the exploits of the super scary APT group that non-security general public normies just keep hearing about in the news. Fancy bear. I mean, this stuff is hard. It's confusing. Not a lot of people understand the nuance of it. They see Swordfish and the Die Hard movie, and that's what sticks in their head of hackers to most people. And like I said in my previous episode on the Sony attack, large swaths of the technical community live by the mantra of POC or GTFO. So, quote, take my word for it, it's the Russians. I wouldn't lie. Didn't go over that well. It would also have been nice to see some IP addresses, usernames, or something other than we have accessed with high confidence or, quote, the FBI accesses with high confidence while the NSA assesses with medium confidence that blah, 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 blah. That's great if you're a trusted advisor to like the president or something like that where you need to make a big decision in a short amount of time, like life or death situations or something. But eventually, I think you need to show some receipts. Link the IP address that I listed earlier to being Russian infrastructure used by APT28 and something else, some usernames, something. But then again, I'm a nobody on a podcast. And I just want to be clear. These aren't all my positions. I want to present as much from different angles and trust that you're a smart person and you can come up with your own conclusions as well. But on the other hand, maybe the clients, in this case the DNC or CrowdStrike in general, just didn't want to reveal it. And that's within their right. But maybe media outlets and news organizations shouldn't be so fast to publish this proof without the evidence. Oh, and I want to be clear here. I'm not saying this was some kind of elaborate hoax carried out by Delta Force or the Men in Black or X-Men or something. Probably was the Russians. At least the Dutch told us how they came to their conclusion, as they observed them through Pwn CCTV television. That's at least something plausible. I guess what I'm saying here is I would like a little more scrutiny around the attribution of these events prior to blindly accepting whatever one company, one analyst, one dossier, one unnamed source says. But that could be said on many topics, I guess. So what's the overall takeaway here? Well, was it probably the Russians? Absolutely. I mean, if you go back to the law and order model that I've discussed in previous episodes, they certainly have the means, motive, and opportunity. But how do we know it's Fancy Bear, APT28, and not APT29, Cozy Bear, the SVR group? Or Energetic Bear? Well, they're kind of focused on in the energy sector, so maybe not. Or maybe Sandworm, newly crowned APT44. Well, that comes down to that none of the other teams have been seen using X-Agent. X-Agent appears to be an APT28 only toolset. APT29 uses more custom-made stuff in my experience, and it's called Cozy Duke and some other names. Sandworm likes black energy and not Petya, which I did an episode on, so you should listen to it. Shameless plug. Energetic Bear likes Havocs. So that kind of explains how this incident was placed on Fancy Bear, from my analysis at least. The infiltration of the Ukrainian military app lays bare the realities of modern cyber warfare. It's a stark reminder that our digital worlds are deeply intertwined with physical battlefields. Malware, like Fancy Bear's X-Agent, have evolved beyond just gathering intelligence. It's become a weapon system, integrated into broader military operations. The ability to track and anticipate enemy movements in real time provides tactical edge that can shift the balance of power. Even if the claims in this report, you believe, are a bit hyperbolic or overstated, it's not difficult to imagine consequences of comparable campaigns. In September 2024, reporting came out that Israelis infiltrated the supply chain of Hezbollah and provided the terrorist organization radios and beepers that would explode, killing the person wearing them based off a command given to the device, or at the very least seriously hurt them. Hezbollah had already discovered how hostile that communications environment was for them on smartphones and pivoted to beepers and radios as a more secure way for them to communicate. It appears that it was even more hostile for them, though. But back to this incident. I could have an entire episode on battlefield cyber warfare, but I guess this is a good time to plug some of my previous episodes on the topic. Cyber wars, meme war, and additional thoughts on cyber war. It's not clear how devastating this attack was. CrowdStrike and the Ukrainian government seem to have disagreements on how widely used this app was and how many howitzers were removed from the battlefield because of it. Not to mention how many were removed just in general by the Russians or the separatists finding them and destroying them. I mean, if these things are firing and there's planes, drones, and satellites in the sky, it's not hard to conclude where they're at. And they can be found rather fast. But taking a second to jump into the hypothetical worst-case scenario, the Ukrainian soldiers had no idea that their trusted targeting app had been compromised, and to them, it functioned perfectly normal, never revealing the silent malware operating in the background, siphoning their every move. To the Russians, it meant you could collect intel on the units with the app or just drop ballistic missiles, or in today's terms, drones, glide bombs, hypersonic missiles on those locations. Not to mention the conflict has escalated since then. And with the caveats, like I said earlier, there are more advanced howitzers on the battlefield these days. We've entered an era where the digital and physical worlds are blurring. Commercial and military and nation states, they're all kind of blending together. Mobile devices are no longer just tools for communications and work. On the modern battlefield, they've become vectors for cyber attacks that can deal very, very real damage. And on that cheery note, I think this is a good place to stop. If you found this episode insightful, please share it. I don't run ads or anything like that. My growth is organically driven from listeners like you. So any review on iTunes, likes, share on social media, etc., it's greatly appreciated. And check out more stories of cyber attacks and the threat actors that conduct them on IntrusionsInDepth.com. I'm Josh Stepp. Thanks for listening.